What's up, guys? Levi here, and this is my next installment of my band album ranking series. So, in the previous video, I did one for the Architects, and for this one, I'm doing Asking Alexandria. Oh boy. So, essentially, what I'll be doing throughout this series is basically just going through like an A to Z of list of bands that I've really listen to all their albums a number of times. That way I can just give like a bit of a definitive ranking of everything. And then some of the bands that I listen to just sort of more casually, I'll probably do those bands kind of after. So I want to do other bands such as Alexis on Fire and Alice in Chains, for example, but I've not listened to their back catalogue like in depth enough to be able to do something like this. Whereas with Asking Alexandria, I've been listening to them for a number of years now, and I've listened to all their albums a number of times, so it's kind of easy to do something like that. So what I'll be doing here is I'll be ranking all their albums from worst to best. As I've said in the previous video, just because I've ranked them a certain way doesn't mean that that's how it should be definitively. I know some people are going to have their favourites, some people are going to have their worst albums. There's going to be a couple of hot takes in this, but at the end of the day, it's just my own personal opinion. So the band's history is kind of an interesting one. So back in 2003, Ben Bruce moved to Dubai and formed a band there, which he'd called Asking Alexandria. However, after kind of realizing that he wasn't going to be successful, like internationally, doing this all from Dubai, he decided to move back to England and then formed another band. But he ended up keeping the name for it anyway, so the band has actually been around for quite a long time. It's had basically two iterations, being the initial band he had in Dubai and then the one he had after he moved back to England. But the band found a lot of success, especially when they decided to move to the States, releasing their first two albums, which are held in high regard to the fan base and are the sort of albums that the fan base want the band to be doing even nowadays. After their third album, Danny Warsnop then left the band, and then the band brought in Dennis Stoff, and they released one album with him before he then ended up leaving as well. At which point they ended up bringing Danny Warsnop back to the band, and the band's remained pretty much the same ever since, apart from touring wise when they had Paul Bartholomew for a while. But anyway, we will get to the ranking. So at number 8, I've put Stand Up and Scream. Now, I know that this album is a very popular album amongst the fans. I know this is the album that skyrocketed them into, fame and word of mouth and everything. So in 2012, when I started listening to the band, I checked out some of their older stuff as well. I was aware of the band because the final episode was a very popular song at the time. But for me, it just never grabbed me. I wasn't really into the heavier music at the time, but around the time that they'd released their Reckless and Relentless like mini film and Run Free, I dabbled into the band a little bit more, checked out their older albums, thought, holy shit, this is actually really good. So back at the time, I did hold Stand Up and Scream to like a very high regard, but in listening to it recently, I think it's kind of more of a product of its time. It's not to say that the album is bad as well, because it does have some great songs on there, like Illyrian, Final Episode, Candlelit Dinner Within a Mortar, Not the American Average, The Prophecy, but in listening to some of the more, like, less popular songs, like, as an album, it just doesn't gel with me as much anymore as it did back when I started listening to the more heavier music. So, the opening portion of the album is actually really good. And then after the first 3 songs, it kind of just goes like up and down in terms of songs that I like, songs that I don't like, songs that I'd listen to, and I know that I've said it's a product of its time, and even then, I'd still like the band to, maybe go back and maybe, remake the album, modernize it a little bit, like Black Veil Brides did with their first album, like Bring Me the Horizon are doing with their first album as well. It'd be interesting to see what they could do nowadays. Yeah, I just don't think the album has aged all that well, in my opinion, anyway. I know some people still hold it to high regard. I know some people still religiously listen to this album. But, there has to be a last place. And I know some people are surprised that, the album that's next isn't last place. But, we'll get to that in a second. So, overall, I gave Stand Up and Scream a 62%, which is not horrible by any means. And there are still songs that, if I wanted to listen to Asking Alexandria one day, I would consider listening to some songs off of this album. But as like a full album experience, I just couldn't do it anymore. So coming in at number 7, which is probably everybody else's number 8, is Like a House on Fire. Now, this was probably the most disappointing album for all the fans because loads of fans wanted those first 2 or 3 albums. That's what fans want even to this day. They want, Stand Up and Scream 2, Reckless and Relentless 2, Death to Destiny 2. But then they did AALP 5, which was a very successful album, and a lot of people liked a lot of songs on there. Like, I even liked a lot of songs on there, and I felt that if they'd have continued with that sort of sound, it would have been a good place for them, because this was at the point where Danny didn't want to do much screaming anymore. He didn't particularly vibe with heavy music anymore. So at the time, I thought that this was like kind of the perfect middle ground for the band. But then they released Like a House on Fire, and it was the most pop album that they could have done, short of covering Taylor Swift for 10 songs. Overall, I think it was a pretty decent album. My main criticism is, though, that it's not an album to listen to from start to finish, because every song just has kind of the same structure, being that you have your calm, softer verses, and then you get these grand choruses, which is a good structure for a song. But to hear that basically, like 12, 13 times in a row was just, it kind of makes the whole album experience a bit of a drag and a bit boring. Like, they did have good songs on the album as well. They had Like a House on Fire, which I think is a really good song. Anti-Socialist, I do like that song as well. Take Some Time, Here's to Starting Over, All Due Respect, What's Gonna Be as well. They're all good songs, but in the context of a full album from start to finish, it does kind of make everything a bit of a drag. One song off this album that I just absolutely despise is, funny enough, the heaviest song on the album, being Down to Hell. I remember listening to this for the first time, and I just felt it was kind of more of an insult to the hardcore fans that wanted, a heavier song. On AALP 5, we had Eve, and then on this album, we have Down to Hell, which was probably like the most heaviest song on the album, but even then, it was just like hard rock. Even The Violence, which is kind of, again, a bit more of a hard rock, heavier song, to me, it just didn't vibe. Like, even when I'd first listened to it, I was just kind of a bit like, okay. And then they end with Lorazepam, which, again, is just bad. I don't mind that the band kind of wants to do kind of more rock and roll songs every now and again, but at least make some good rock and roll songs, But overall, I gave this album a 67%, which, again, it's not horrible, but if they'd have made this album like a little bit shorter, trimmed some of the fat out, and made the sort of experience a little bit more better, instead of listening to like the same song over and over again, I think it would have made for a better album. Coming in at number 6, we have AALP 5. When they released the first single for this album, being Into the Fire, I liked the song, don't get me wrong, but I was a little bit skeptical of where this album was going to go. Were they just going to water down their sound like bands have notoriously done because they wanted to basically cling on to the success that the Spirit got for Bring Me the Horizon, for example. Before this album came out as well, I did see some teasers of Danny in the studio screaming "I am iniquity," which it did sound very good. It sounded like at least we were going to get some heaviness on this album. This album as well it's just a little bit of a mixed bag for me. You've got Alone in a Room, which is probably one of their better songs on that album, and then Into the Fire, which I did like when I first heard it. It just left me with some skepticism. The next few songs were okay, and then they had, Under Dever and Vultures, which I just didn't vibe with at all. And then you had Eve, which is probably the best song on the album. And then you had I Am One and Empire. Empire was one of those songs. I don't know why they released it. Like, I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe people liked it. I don't know, but I just thought it was like really bad. That song definitely stuck out like a sore thumb on that album. And then you had Room 138, which definitely one of their better album closers. I think the story behind Room 138 was really interesting. And just hearing some of those feelings and vulnerabilities that Danny had about that situation, through the context of a song as well, I just think that really meant something. But in terms of songs that I would most likely listen to on this album, if I was to say to myself, I fancy listening to LP5 today, it's Alone in a Room and even Room 138 that I would be drawn to the most. Under Denver and Vultures are the ones that I'd be looking to skip. But overall, I gave this album a 69%, which isn't too bad. But again, I just think this album has some problems with it. I think that they were leaning a little bit too much into watering down their sound to try and get some more commercial success, which it can work for bands, but for me, this one just didn't really vibe with me that much. Coming in at number 5, which is the most divisive album that's probably been released by this band, is The Black. Now, when Danny left the band, there was like a lot of speculation who was going to take over on vocals. By the time the first song came out, which was I Won't Give In, I remember listening to that song quite a lot around the time, and I still think it's a pretty decent song. So I was willing to give Dennis a chance. I'd heard some of his other stuff in his other bands as well, which he definitely had the chops for it. He definitely had the chops to do like heavier music, sort of harken back to those first 3 albums that they did. So I was willing to give him a chance. And then the other singles came out, being The Black and Let It Sleep. And I thought to myself, yeah, they've definitely found their vocalist here. Now, this album came out, and I've said before that I'm not the sort of person that just looks for heaviness in an album. Like, I just want good songwriting and things that people can connect to. But for me, the only time this album really hit for me were the heavier songs. So, Let It Sleep, The Black, stuff like that. The one exception I will make is Here I Am. I did think that was a really good song, which is probably one of the songs that I'm lean more towards listening to when I listen to this album. But songs like Just a Slave to Rock and Roll and Send Me Home, they really dragged the album down for me. And Gone as well, I wasn't a fan of that. I know why that song was made, and I know the meaning behind it, but it's just one of those songs I just cannot, it's just not clicking with me. But I do respect them for releasing that song based on what had happened. And then they did Circled by Wolves, which I think was a really good album closer. I think it was something that kind of showed their strengths in terms of heaviness, but also in terms of doing good choruses as well. Now, if I was to listen to The Black, the 3 songs that I would want to listen to most would be Let It Sleep, The Black, and Here I Am. The songs that I would be sort of hesitant to listen to would be Gone, Send Me Home, and Just a Slave to Rock and Roll. Unfortunately, after this album, there was this whole drama between Dennis and the band. Dennis had apparently had sent Ben a message saying that Asking Alexandria doesn't exist until I get what I'm owed. Which it's been speculated over the years exactly what that meant. I think Dennis at one point had said that he just wanted time off to go back home because there was tensions there in terms of there was just tensions there and he just wanted to be home with his family. And then in the midst of all the controversy that was going on last year with Danny's vocal performances, he then came out and said that he was actually owed quite a lot of money by the record label and the band. So it's a bit up in the air as to what actually happened. Only Dennis really knows what happened. But I try not to think about that when I'm listening to this album because he did do a really good job with this album. And if they were to carry on working together, I think that they could have done a lot more good. Obviously, with the fact that both bands, so Drag Me Out and Asking Alexandria, both released two very similar songs because Dennis felt that he had ownership over what was eventually going to be Alone in a Room. They both released those songs, so I think even if Danny hadn't have come back and Dennis would have stayed with the band, I think the band would have still had a bit of an evolution in sound, especially since Drag Me Out's first album felt very much like a continuation, based on the evolution that Asking Alexandria did from the Black to LP5. Overall, I give this album a 69% as well, but in terms of LP5 versus the Black, I think the Black just edges it out ever so slightly. And then number 4, which is going to be a bit of a hot take, but I've put Reckless and Relentless here. So I know that Reckless and Relentless is basically what people consider to be their best work. Just like with Stand Up and Scream, at the time, I thought that this was one of the best post-hardcore / metalcore albums that had come out at the time. Upon listening to it nowadays, there are some issues with it, but I still do hold this to high regard, in comparison to Stand Up and Scream, and I still do think that Reckless and Relentless is a very good album. I think it did age quite well. You've got Welcome, Dear Insanity, and Closure, which as an album opener, chef's kiss. Just like with Stand Up and Scream, for me, it's just kind of like an up and down sort of album for me. It kind of does have its problems, like The Match doesn't really vibe with me, and Another Bottle Down, I used to like that song, but when I listened to it recently, I was just a bit like, I'm not sure I really like this as much anymore. But there were a lot of good songs on this album. You had Dear Insanity, Closure, Someone Somewhere, Breathless, Motti at Dabo. I could still listen to this album nowadays and get some enjoyment out of it, minus a couple of songs. But overall, I think that the 3 albums that I'm about to talk about, I think that they were a lot stronger in terms of what the band could do. If I was to listen to this album, the main 3 songs I want to listen to this for would be Closure, Breathless, and Motte at Dabo. And then the songs that bring this album kind of down for me are The Match and Another Bottle Down. Overall, I give this album an 81%, which is pretty decent in comparison to the other ones that we've just had. We've essentially jumped from the 60% to now the 80%, which kind of does show just how much better this album is in comparison to the other ones that I've talked about. So I'm not writing this album off by any means. I do like it. I do think it's an enjoyable album, but I just don't think it kind of hits the heights that the other ones do for me. Coming in at number 3, we have From Death to Destiny. So this album was the last album with Danny Warsnop before he then left the band for a little bit. I think that this album is a really good album. I think that the songwriting on it was really strong. I think the riffs on it were really strong as well. The opening riff to Don't Pray For Me, it just felt very Slipknot-like. I did like the fact that Danny was singing more on this album. I think that the contrast between harsh vocals and clean vocals, I think that was kind of like the perfect fit. But you have like a really strong opening first few tracks, and then sort of in the middle of the album, it's kind of, it's just okay. And then you have a good ending. Sorry, you have a good album closer with Howard Jones known for Killswitch Engage, called Until the End, which I think was a really good song. I did listen to the extended edition where they had Dead on there and the other version of The Death of Me on there, and things, songs like that. I did think that Dead was a really strong song for them as well. I don't mind the Death of Me rock mix. It's definitely easier to sing along to if I'm like at work just chilling or something like that. But overall, if I was to listen to this album, like the main three songs that I would be drawn to would be Don't Pray For Me, Killing You, and Poison. I think Poison's like a really good song. Yeah, I think Poison's a really good song. It's one of those songs where, you've got your like really heavy bits and your riffy bits, and then you've got just like those choruses where Danny's able to sort of show his vocal ability. There's only one song in particular that kind of drags this album down for me, and it's White Line Fever. It's just one of those songs that it's never really vibed with me, even when I listened to this album for the first time. Like, and when I was listening to this album, I listened to it from start to finish almost every single time throughout the majority of this album cycle. It's just White Line Fever for me was where I was sort of itching to, skip over to the next song. But overall, I gave this an 81%, which is the same as what I gave Reckless and Relentless, but I think this album just edges it out. After this, obviously, Danny had then left the band, and then they got Dennis in, and then Dennis left, and it was just kind of a whole mess. So this leaves our last two albums, which, funnily enough, for the most recent two, I don't think this is recency bias as much as it's just, I think as I've gotten older, I kind of appreciate some of these bands that started out, chugging and everything, crabcore and all that sort of stuff. I think I've kind of grown up with a lot of these bands, so them wanting to evolve their sound into something else, I'm open to it. I'm very accepting of it. Like I said in the Architects video, I listened to a lot of Linkin Park when I was younger, and they evolved their sound constantly as well. Coming in at number 2, we have See What's on the Inside. I still stand by my thoughts that if the band had kept that sound and just released a few more albums, I would have been absolutely fine with it. I thought that this was the perfect evolution for the band. The band could do heavier music themselves, but Danny could still just do, a bit more of a clean vocal performance on the album instead of, half screaming, half clean vocals, something like that. But I just think that this album was such a good evolution for them, especially after what had come previously, which was like A House on Fire. But their first 5 tracks on that album definitely made the album. And then it hit a little bit of a lull with songs like Find Myself, You've Made It This Far, and See What's on the Inside. And then you've got Misery Loves Company, which I do really like that song. And then Fame, I wasn't a big fan. To me, Fame just seemed very much like a We Are Harlot song more than an Asking Alexandria song. And then it ended with The Grey, which to me kind of sounded like it gave me kind of an Avenged Sevenfold vibe, which the intro and Alone Again also gave me that vibe of Avenged Sevenfold. Maybe they were really influenced by that band when they were writing songs for this album. Who knows? Overall, as an experience from start to finish, minus Fame, I think that this album's very cohesive and it does a good enough job, which is a massive improvement to the previous album where it just kind of felt like you were listening to 13 songs, same song kind of over and over again. They kind of did some different things with this album, which I can really appreciate. If I was to listen to this album, the 3 songs that I want to listen to this album for would be Alone Again, Faded Out, and Never Gonna Learn. I think those 3 songs are definitely the strongest songs on the album. The only song that really drags this album down for me is Fame. But overall, I thought this album was a very enjoyable experience. I gave it an 82%, which is only 1% above From Death to Destiny. So it's not as if I love this album like infinitely more than Death to Destiny and Reckless and Relentless. I just think that this album, like I said, if they were to do this style of music for the rest of their careers, I'd have been happy with it. And then at number one, we've got Where Do We Go From Here? I don't know if this is recency bias or if it's just the fact that I just connected with this album so well. It was good to hear Danny sort of using more harsh vocals again. And I think that it was like a good evolution from See What's on the Inside to this album. You know, they still kept the heavier sound, added some more riffs to that album essentially. And I feel like the evolution from See What's on the Inside to Where Do We Go From Here was a very good one because you still had the heavier moments from See What's on the Inside, just with a few extra riffs added into it. And then you had Danny, who was starting to use some of those more harsh vocals again, which is always a welcome addition. Let's not beat around the bush. For Dark Void, they kind of blueballed a lot of fans a little bit, saying, you wanted heavy, whereas like it was just Danny just like doing one scream. Even then, I could get past that, and I did think that Dark Void was a very good song. Um, I do think that Bad Blood was definitely better. One thing that I will massively praise for this album is James's drumming performance on this album. I think James absolutely knocked it out of the park with his drumming. I think that, Ben, Cameron, and Sam, with all the guitars, I think they did an incredible job as well. And I have to say that this is probably Danny's strongest vocal performance in years. Like, you got Bad Blood, Things Could Be Different, and Let Go, which I think is a very strong opening for the album. Psycho for me was just horrible. Like, I don't know why they released that. Maybe it was just like that one song that they could release to appease Danny and just not wanting to do heavy music anymore. I don't know. That song could have been definitely left off of the album. Then you got Dark Void, Nothing Left, Feel, which, all really good songs. Let the Dead Take Me. I know that was a very weird song for a lot of people, but I kind of liked how weird that song was. It's a very fun song to listen to as well. And then you had Kill It With Fire, which again was a bit of another weird song because it was very, post-punk sort of sound. And I think that was Ben doing the vocal performance with like all the screams on it as well, which was really cool. And then you had Holding On to Something More and Where Do We Go From Here, which Where Do We Go From Here was one of the more softer songs, which I did like an awful lot. If I was to listen to this album, the main three songs that I would want to listen to this album for would be Bad Blood, Let It Go, and Nothing Left. I think they're the three strongest songs on that album. The main song that would put me off listening to this album, or the main song that I most likely skip, would be Psycho. Because again, it's just like, what the fuck were they thinking? But overall, I give this album an 85%. So hasn't hit 90s for this band just yet. Maybe there'll be time. Maybe there's constant rumors of the band just kind of calling it a day at this point because Danny's kind of clocked out at this point and Ben's not touring with them anymore or anything like that. I think he's still writing though, which is good. So he'll probably be doing some writing for the new album whenever that happens. Ben was very much the heart and soul of the band. You could tell that he really cared about this band. He viewed it more as a family than, a band, a job, anything like that. He really cares about his fans as well. So hopefully he'll be involved in the next album in some capacity, whether it be he's gonna write most of the album since he's at home a lot now, but only time will tell. Hopefully this band will continue to do music. It's just going to be a case of figuring out what to do next because, like I said, Danny's kind of clocked out at this point. It really does show when you see some of the live performances that they put on last year where Danny was basically lip syncing, if you can even call it that, because there were some points I've seen in the footage where you could tell he just clearly wasn't lip syncing. He just clearly just couldn't be asked at that point. Obviously, the Warped Tour performance was very notorious to the point where Sam ended up putting a post on Instagram saying that he was sorry, which I do feel for the band. Like, the band's got a lot of stick. I know that there's talk of Danny holding the band back, you know, the whole he doesn't want to scream anymore, he doesn't like heavy music, you know, he's not actually a member of the band, he's just like a contracted member of the band as opposed to like an actual member. But I think the band's on a bit of a hiatus at the moment, just figuring out what's going to come next. James did some work with Breaking Benjamin, and then Sam and Cameron have been teasing some heavy music which isn't related to the band, which, you know, if they're going to do heavy music on the side, I'll be fine with that, you know, because you can tell that they still want to make heavy music. So having like that kind of side project to just work on, just the two of them, I think would be a good idea, and I'd be looking forward to seeing what that turns out like. But yeah, it's kind of a grey area in terms of what's happening with the band going forward. Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing a couple more albums out of them. Just don't release like House on Fire Part 2 and 3, for the love of God. But if they were to call it a day, with what we've got, it's a decent career for the band. There's been some misses, you know, and there've been some hits, and I'd like to say that the hits definitely outweighed the misses. But we'll see what happens. Only time will tell. And yeah, if you guys have any thoughts, let me know in the comments. What are your rankings of these albums? How badly am I going to get flamed for putting Stand Up and Scream and Reckless so low in comparison to how everybody else would get them? And yeah, as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.